How many times have people told you that the media being owned by a select few isn't a problem? That these corporations and the bankers that fund them would never propagandize the people for their own interests, and certainly wouldn't endanger lives, that false flags aren't real, and that they would involve way too many people, that a secret that big could never be kept quiet. Media manipulation by bankers with money interests and governments beholden to those bankers is not the exception, it's the rule. There are countless verified examples that government schools conveniently leave out of the history books, and banker-funded media conglomerates are the last people that are going to give you a peek behind the curtain they've woven to protect themselves from the retribution they would surely face if the public were to discover just how little their lives mattered. One of the most well-documented examples of how war profiteers operate that parallels exactly with how these war profiteers operate today is the sinking of the Lusitania, an event that would claim the lives of nearly 2,000 people, including 195 Americans, and would be the false flag to get the American public behind a war that would later claim the lives of over 100,000 Americans. A war that up until this false flag planned by the elites, including J.P. Morgan and his Rothschild backers, and the Wilson administration, was only supported by 1 out of 10 Americans. And the motivations are the same as they've always been: money and power. In the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan, the American agent of the Rothschilds, sold war bonds in America to fund the English and the French in their war with Germany. Not only did they profit through handsome commissions from these bonds, the money raised was then spent at the companies owned by Morgan and the Rothschilds. War was big money. Total purchases would rise to an astronomical $3 billion, which in today's money would be roughly $74 billion. Morgan's firm became the largest purchaser on Earth. And when German U-boats appeared to be turning the tide against England, they faced a very real possibility that this ocean of money would dry up. This would mean substantial losses to their balance sheets. Additionally, this would also threaten England's ability to repay the billions of dollars it had borrowed with war bonds. In fact, Morgan was finding it difficult just to sell the bonds that funded his military-industrial complex, as it appeared the Germans might claim victory in a matter of months. To make matters worse, Morgan himself had loaned around $37 billion in today's money that he was now in danger of losing. Something had to be done. Morgan hired a committee that identified the 25 most influential newspapers. He then installed editors at each of the papers and paid them off to run stories that were pro-war. Eventually, he had over 1,000 newspaper editors on his payroll and used his vast advertising purchasing power to strong-arm the smaller papers to trumpet the same pro-war sentiment. The Rockefellers of Standard Oil, who would also profit handsomely from the war, used its own publishing companies to influence the people against Germany and funneled money to reluctant congressmen. Massive parades were held. But with all this campaigning and social engineering, the polling data still showed that 90% of Americans still favored staying out of the war. Enter the false flag that would plunge the world into war, killing over 100,000 Americans to protect the interests of the bankers and the ruling class. Winston Churchill, who knew all too well without American involvement in the war he would soon lose to Germany, began to work with President Wilson and the bankers on the false flag that would force the American people to support the war: the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania, while built as a British passenger ocean liner, had been retrofitted with armor, revolving gun rings on its decks, and was classified by the British Navy as an armored auxiliary cruiser. Its lower passenger compartments had been removed to make room for the war munitions exported by America's industrial military complex. Churchill ordered the Lusitania and all ships to ignore orders from German U-boats to halt and be searched, and instead to engage the German U-boats or even ram them without warning. He also ordered crews not to treat captured U-boat crews as prisoners of war, but to execute them. This left the German Navy with only one option: to sink ships suspected of delivering war munitions on site. The Lusitania, whose previous captain resigned over Churchill's plan to use passengers as human shields, was loaded with weapons and ammunition sold by the J.P. Morgan Company in violation of every neutrality treaty. The German embassy in Washington filed a complaint to the Wilson administration and was ignored. The Germans went so far as to attempt to run ads in American newspapers warning Americans not to board the weapon-carrying ship traveling through a war zone, but the papers controlled by the bankers and by order of the State Department refused to run the ads. Using the media as a weapon against the people is not a new thing. The bankers and the politicians they owned were purposely sending unaware Americans right into a deadly trap. The so-called passenger liner carrying over 6 million rounds of ammunition was directed by the British Navy into an area where a German U-boat had recently fired upon 2 ships and was known to be active. To ensure the ship would be vulnerable, the destroyer that was supposed to escort the cargo to port was called back without notifying the Lusitania, leaving her a sitting duck in hostile waters. And on May 7th, 1915, close to 2,000 passengers, including 195 Americans, were sacrificed to the bankers as the German U-boat, U-20, fired at the hull, setting off a massive explosion when the munitions in the cargo ripped a hole so large in her starboard bow that one of the largest ships ever built sank in less than 18 minutes. The Lusitania was purposely loaded full of explosives and then led defenselessly into hostile waters in the hopes that it would be sunk by the Germans. This was the false flag that propelled America into what would become known as World War I, a war that easily could have ended before claiming the lives of over 100,000 Americans, that died so that the military-industrial complex and the banking class could avoid losing money on a profitable war. A war that would later lead to another world war that would claim the lives of millions. All this so bankers could grow fat on the blood of the people that would line up for the slaughter, war after war after war. The details of this false flag have been largely hidden from the public. In fact, as recently as 1993, the official story was that the Lusitania had exploded because of coal dust in the boiler rooms, and that it had not been carrying ammunition or explosives. The real story remained hidden from the public for nearly 100 years, until in 2008 when divers found millions of rounds in the hull of the sunken wreckage. The media had successfully covered up a false flag for nearly a century, a fact that completely obliterates the notion that false flags involve too many people, and that surely someone would talk, and that the truth would get out. People who don't know their history are damned to repeat it. Do we have to wait another century before we get the truth of modern false flags perpetrated by the bankers and the deep state? When will the people stop confirming the ruling class's belief that we are all just cattle to be slaughtered for profit? Slaves that unknowingly prop them up and support their lifestyle of decadence and degeneracy, fighting for table scraps and vying for the coveted position as alpha slave, while the ruling class looks down at us not in pity, but with amusement and disgust. The technocrats are developing new ways to control us and eventually make us obsolete. We are rapidly approaching a future in which the ruling class will have successfully replaced us with lower IQ populations that are easier to control and easier to replace with automation. We must stop them now and expose them for who they are now, because we don't have another century to wait for the truth to come out. It's not just about the deaths on the Lusitania. It's not about the deaths in World War I, which led to all the deaths in World War II. World War II led to the deaths of nearly 500,000 American men. American men that might not have voted for the Immigration Act of 1965. And lest we forget, without World War II, there would have been no baby boom. That decision by those bankers, the Wilson administration and Churchill, to sacrifice the lives of unwitting pawns in their war profiteering game so they could increase their profits. The effects of that evil decision have irreversibly damaged this nation in every measurable way. And look at the British now, arresting people for thought crimes. The fairy tale that we were protecting freedom was always a lie. The truth is, we live in a system that rewards sociopaths, and sociopaths do what's good for them. Nationalism is their enemy. Populism is their enemy because it gets in the way of their balance sheets.
The douchebag you're about to see is from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. This is an American think tank out of Washington, D.C. It was established in 1985, and it says the mission statement of the Institute, quote, is to advance a balanced and realistic understanding of American interests in the Middle East and to promote the policies that secure them. Not about what's right and wrong over there. It's just whatever secures the American interests over in the Middle East. And we all know what those interests are. It has nothing to do with spreading democracy or freedom or liberty. For more on that, all you have to do is look at the board of advisors and look at some of the names on here. You've got Henry Kissinger, Richard Pearl, Condoleezza Rice, George Shultz, James Woolsey. It's a fun crowd. And it doesn't matter which president you think you're voting for, it's going to change everything. People that have been part of this particular think tank have served senior positions in the administrations of every president this country has had since George H.W. Bush.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran.
He just said that. You aren't hearing things. He literally just said, crisis initiation's tough, and how's the United States president going to get to war with Iran? Because wars don't just happen. They make the war.
Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests.
The traditional way that America gets to war is what's best for the interests. Now, listen to what the traditional way is that America goes to war.
Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor.
False flag.
Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode.
Also a false flag.
Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode.
Total false flag.
We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded.
Probably also a false flag.
May I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack.
Also a false flag. Do you see a pattern here?
So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
Period. If the Iranians don't compromise, it would be best if someone started this war. Because that is how America goes to war. You literally have the douchebags who stand up there in these think tanks and say stuff like this. It's not even thinly veiled. There's not even a semantic argument that could be made here that he actually meant something else. He straight up said someone needs to start this war. The way that all of America's other wars have been started. With a false flag.
One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why?
Somebody actually laughed in the audience when he said that.
We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. You know, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things.
He's not advocating that. He's just suggesting that you can do some things, which is basically the same as advocating it.
We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
They're in the game of doing that to everybody. This is how America goes to war. You don't know when World War III is going to break out, but when it does, you'll know why.